go ahead and get started on icebreaker ships because this is a very it's one of those things that you hear in shipping, and I don't know that I have had the full grasp on it, on why people even want to establish this shipping lane. Did you know about this, I guess, shipping lane or
Uh,
shipping story before, we were doing research for this?
I, I guess no, not in particular. I mean, I know of icebreakers clearly, just like being where I'm from and have seen them before, but no, not in particular. No.
Well, I think for the first, I want to play this. I want to start off this section with why this sea route is important. Because essentially, what we have
Yes.
throughout the world is that we have these shipping lanes, these big trade lanes, which are safe passages or somewhat safe passages that giant cargo ships, oil tankers, fishing vessels that they can travel through and end up at their destination in the quickest, most efficient time period. And with this new route that is opening up, largely in part because of the ice melting in the Arctic region. So that's the North Pole. We're not talking about Antarctica, which is the South Pole. So the North Pole is where a lot of this ice is melting, and it's starting to open up faster and more efficient shipping lanes. But that brings a whole lot of discussion, geopolitical, natural resources. It brings up a whole lot of discussions. But first, before we get into some of our favorite takeaways about learning about this topic, I want to play this video that will kind of give like a good, I think, overarching view of what this is and why it's important. So let's play the clip.
This is the Northwest Passage. It's a sea passage that spans 900 miles and joins the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic archipelago. It may look insignificant, but the truth is, this passage has the potential to change everything. The only problem is that it doesn't exist yet. Well, sort of. You see, we've known about this passage for centuries, but it's always too covered in sea ice to be used for regular marine shipping during most of the year. But now this is all potentially changing. Since 1979, the Arctic sea ice has declined by 40%, with NASA saying it's currently disappearing at a rate of 13% per decade. Put simply, the Arctic sea ice is melting and also being replaced with thinner, seasonal ice due to climate change. And this means that eventually, whether it be by 2050, 2100, or somewhere in between, the Northwest Passage will become fully navigable for mega container ships for at least a few months out of the year. The importance and geopolitical ramifications of this cannot be understated. In fact, the reason we've known of this passage for centuries is because of how transformative it would be, even back then. European explorers, beginning with Christopher Columbus in 1492, searched for a direct trade route from Western Europe to East Asia, but they never found one. It took until 1850 for the first icy northern passage to be discovered, or well, technically invented, and until 1906 when it was finally traversed by the legendary Roald Amundsen. Since that first crossing, there have been at least 320 transits up until 2021, with 38 of them being from 2019 to 2021, showing it's still a pretty challenging passage to traverse.
So I'm going to stop it right there because that's a really good point to, I guess, intro this discussion of what exactly like icebreaker ships are. Now you kind of have a general overview of what's happening in that region and why these ships are starting to be needed. Basically, with icebreakers, there's two types of icebreakers where one has a bow that sticks out much further than, I guess, sort of the top of a traditional ship of what you can see. It has an underneath that sort of, can bust through the ice up to 6 feet of ice that it can bust through before the actual, I guess, sort of real part of the bow that you see on a traditional ship makes it has to sort of slosh through it. So there's that method of it, and then there's another method of an icebreaker ship that they almost try to go as fast as possible so they can get up on the ice and then come down and crack it that way. And so there's a bunch of different like videos where they can see like especially in this region of cargo ships and or mostly like oil and gas ships that are being caught in this ice up north in the Arctic, and these icebreaker ships have to go through and do one of those two methods in order to carve out a path for those ships to make it through. So I'll stop right there since we, I had the video and explained it a little more. But what I guess what are your first thoughts when you know about that, when you learn about this history, when in the region that you're in? What are sort of your, I guess, favorite takeaways about icebreaker ships?
Well, in general, I think it's interesting for just trade domestically here in the U.S. how much of it is dependent on this as well. Let alone what we'll see in the future. I think the stat I pulled for this lane in particular was by 2050, I believe. This will be the primary point of transit between Europe and Asia. So clearly a huge impact it's going to have on global trade, let alone what we see just domestically as well. I'm trying to look at the stat right now. I think it was around just in Great Lakes, icebreaking alone supports over 90 million tons of cargo annually.
Oh, wow.
So imagine what that number is going to look like, especially once it becomes such a main trade line. I mean, here it's interesting. I wish I would have pulled some sonar charts from this and might be able to send you some later. But theoretically, we don't really have much, right, for this lane. But it's one of my favorite sonar charts we do have at Freight Waves is the Panama Canal Index. That's not exactly what it's called, but it's kind of what we call internally. And it helps you kind of see the rates between going to LA ports compared to going to something like Houston based on the availability of going through the Panama Canal at that time, right? So it gives you like this flux of a different option. That's why we see so much investment in Dallas and Houston, et cetera, because of that path, because the Panama Canal, of course, was widened, which led for more of that option. So I get really excited just from like a data standpoint to see like how that would affect overall, like what we see on trade lanes right now, even through the United States and so on. So I think it's really cool to like consider and think, right? Like just because of these icebreakers, the global ramifications of it. I think I wonder if you're going to get to it, but I mean, we have a whole pact, right, based on this lane. It's called the Ice Pact, and it's between, I believe, the U.S., Russia. Let me double
China,
check.
the Inuit people.
United States, Canada, and Finland. And so between the three of us, there's the U.S. Coast Guard has two main icebreakers that they're starting to use as of July of this year to start cutting that ice that you just went over, right?
Well,
So
it's a little complicated in that regard because
yeah.
we've only had 2 of those
Yes.
icebreaker ships, and they're
Yes, literally.
decades old. So
Yes.
meanwhile, like Russia has more than 50, and a few of them are nuclear. One of them in the Arctica, I believe, is the name of the ship, and it's nuclear powered. So it
Yeah.
doesn't have to go back to port. And so
Yeah.
it can just patrol, it can traverse. And so what's happening with a lot of this Arctic ice melt is that it's exposing more, shoreline and more land, especially
True.
for like Canada, for example. And so Russia has essentially, claimed a lot of these passageways and these routes, and are like, no, you have to pay a fee. And Canada's like, no, you are going to
Yeah.
there because this is
So
our
like go talk to NATO. Yeah.
like we're going to be friends and
Yeah.
this and
But a big issue that we do have outside of this lane in particular is there's not many United States owned cargo carriers, right? As part of this. So it's interesting, like, could this be a lane that finally gives the United States an option to gain some traction on that fact, right? To have more carriers under the United States sail. And I think that also could be interesting, right? The political ramifications are something that clearly is going to have to be discussed at some point. But it's almost like if you've played not war, what's the game? I haven't played it so long. We're going to different countries. Now all of a sudden there's just a different path for you to take. How much that could change, like, trade relationships, right? Like maybe to talk about Russia, I mean, maybe that is a relationship we grow even more so, just knowing that the economic ramifications of ignoring that relationship, right? So I mean, it sounds like we'll probably air after the election, but like, ooh, like it's crazy to think like that could be an election topic, right? In like the next
Yeah.
couple of years.
Are you in freight sales with a book of business looking for a new home? Or perhaps you're a freight agent in need of a better partnership? These are the kinds of conversations we're exploring in our podcast interview series called The Freight Agent Trenches, sponsored by SPI Logistics. Now, I can tell you all day that SPI is one of the most successful logistics firms in North America who helps their agents with back office operations such as admin, finance, IT, and sales, but I would much rather you hear it directly from SPI's freight agents themselves. And what better way to do that than by listening to the experienced freight agents tell their stories behind the how and the why they joined SPI. Hit the freight agent link in our show notes to listen to these conversations, or if you're ready to make the jump, visit spi3pl.com.
Well, it's to your earlier point about the Panama Canal, and for cargo companies or for cargo ship companies, carriers, the route from San Francisco to Rotterdam, Netherlands via the Arctic route would take about 7,000 nautical miles, while San Fran to Rotterdam via the Panama Canal is about 9,000 miles. That's about a 40% difference in
Yeah.
nautical miles by taking the Arctic route versus taking the Panama Canal route. And you can have more weight if you take the Arctic route because you're limited when you go through the
Mhm.
Panama Canal. You have to have certain weight
True.
restrictions.
Yeah.
And then there's also this initiative, because I'm sure most people have heard about the China Belt and Road Initiative. They have another initiative called the Polar Silk Road. And so if you know your history, you know that Silk Road was this, major, I guess, trade road from the East Asian countries over to Europe and, Western Asian countries that are, partaking in trade. It was one of the first, I guess, human civilization, I guess not tactics, maybe tactics is the right word for here. But it was mostly human trade was set
Yeah.
up in a variety of ways. Human trade and commodity trading was
Yeah.
set up through this Silk Road. And so they're calling this the Polar Silk Road. And so it's because of no restrictions. You can get there faster. So it brings up a lot of, I guess, sort of environmental debate too. Like, because of global warming and because of everything that's going on in the Arctic with this ice melting, you almost have to ask yourself too, like, are we even going to need icebreakers in the next couple decades? Because you have Russia that has
Yeah.
more than 50 of these icebreakers. You have China that's building out a ton of icebreakers, and they're doing it to take advantage of this new trade route that is starting to open up. And they believe that that it's estimated by like 2035 that we're going to have just a huge section of this Northwest Passage route that's going to be completely open for anyone to use. And so now, from a geopolitical standpoint, you have Canada that's like, no, we're going to start charging fees, sort of like Panama or Egypt. They're charging fees to go through the Suez Canal, to go through the Panama Canal. Canada wants to do the same thing because there's not that much economic activity going on up there, which is another sort of, I guess, a negative aspect of this polar trade route, is that there aren't many ports. And that a lot of, for the Inuit people that have been there they're called like Canada's first peoples. And there's so many like livelihoods that are set up in these northern like regions, and their way of life is melting away before their eyes. And so it brings up like these conversations of, okay, if you're going to establish these trade routes and you're going to maybe start building ports along these trade routes, because right now there are hardly any
True.
ports along this trade route, like you should be involving these people who are already having their lives impacted. And then also think about it from the lens of, if one of like an oil tanker goes down in the Arctic, like that is devastating to
True.
these
True.
communities, because you can't even clean up the oil because the ice makes it incredibly difficult to be able to use, sort of modern, we had a spill in the Gulf.
Yeah.
Deepwater Horizon or something like that, I
Yeah.
think.
Mhm.
But they can use these large sort of nets in the ocean to scoop up all of that oil. You can't do that in the Arctic because you got freaking floating ice going on up
Yeah.
there. So it has like all of these different ramifications, and I just
Well,
thought that
and
was. Go ahead.
even to that point, like I'm thinking about like again, funny or near election season, but the migration that would need to like happen up there to back a port, like do I know right now there's a number of really great like flatbed trucking jobs in Canada and towards the Arctic and Alaska as well, just because it's they're growing communities and things need to get up there and it's a tough drive, right? But now it's like when you sit here and you talk about like putting ports in some of these areas too, it's like they don't have. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen like the most northern town, but it's like
Mhm.
everyone there works for the oil company and there's kind of a grocery store, it's like, and so think about the job creation needed to like support a true port community,
And also
let
to get
alone
you supplies. Like,
yeah,
there was a
and
that
even,
was
even just to live, like putting a grocery store in there. Now you're talking about construction jobs and like the just development of that type of infrastructure is like just really interesting to kind of consider, right? Of like all the moves that would have to make to make sure that this investment, you could say, now is really pays off.
Well, there was another video. It was like a CNBC video that was talking about Arctic shipping, and it was published about a year ago. And there was a gentleman that was on there talking about. He was like a captain. He was talking about the intricacies of sailing through some of these different issues. But he mentioned that during the time of that recording, that only 300 ships have made it through the Arctic since
Wow.
it was that the passage has been discovered.
Yeah.
300 ships. And so it's so new, it's so fresh, and it's so really like actively developing or erasing or kind of maybe a
Yeah.
both like going on at the same time. And it's just I it's very interesting to sort of watch that geopolitical strategic chess pieces being made, because it's something that for a lot of our borders and a lot of our, I guess, countries and the way things have been, this is a new area, much like how we've talked about, sort of the colonization that's going on with the moon. We talked about that in one of our space episodes.
Yeah.
And that is now, you could start to see the chess pieces being made by China, by Russia, and then some of the other NATO countries, and like Finland, Norway, Denmark, all of these huge ports. And what's crazy is that you watch a lot of this stuff and you forget how close these countries are to each other.
Yeah.
I think we're so used to seeing the regular map where it's like the US is on the left and Russia and China's on the right, and it looks so far away. But sorry to the flat earthers out there, but with the circulation of the globe, you can look at the Arctic and just see how close Canada, Russia, like China considers them an Arctic country. Like they
Yeah.
mentioned that in one of their, I'm sure they did it for, economic and political reasons, but they want to be mentioned among some of these Arctic countries, which is also
Interesting.
super interesting because their
Yeah.
Belt and Road Initiative, which for folks who may not know, that's China's initiative to sort of have soft power throughout the rest of the globe by building ports and roads and just like logistics infrastructure in all of these different countries. And they'll do it and they'll pay for it. But if you don't pay them back in a set amount of time for these loans, then they get to seize those ports. They get to seize that infrastructure, which is happening in some African countries. It's probably going to happen in some South American countries. So it's a very it's an interesting thing to watch play out that will likely be decided in our lifetime.
Yeah.
This Arctic ice will largely not exist in the next 30 years. It's going to be a lot of it's going to be melted away. And for the majority of the year, because right now it's only a few months out of the year that these icebreakers are largely being used for these routes. But if
Yeah.
it starts melting away and you have less need for icebreakers, then, I guess maybe the US is playing the long game. And in regards to shipbuilding, much to chagrin of, friend of the show, John Conrad of G Captain, who is,
Yeah.
if you follow him on X, he's always talking about shipbuilding. And China is pretty much kicking our ass in that
Yeah.
regard of shipbuilding. And a good portion of their shipbuilding is for icebreakers. So maybe that's a good thing for the US in the end. There's also a tourism that's kind of taken off for that region too. You have icebreakers, I think, from Norway that will go into the ice. You can pay, thousands of
So
dollars and
cool.
go on this ship, and then you can get off the ship and go just walk around on like the different ice sheets. And
I love that.
I watched
I
this
would do
video of
that.
this family. This guy put on a suit that's like meant to help you if you fall into like prevent hypothermia, and
Yeah.
they let people wear these suits and jump into the Arctic if you want to. And I thought that was pretty cool too. So there's some tourism aspect that's going on there as well. But I just the idea that it's called like the Polar Silk Road, I think is crazy. And it's
Yeah.
not crazy fascinating, I guess. Not like crazy and like, like, I'm going to pull my hair
Well,
out kind of way. But
like you said, in our lifetime, that stat said by 2050, I mean, that's not incredibly far away. Like, that could be the main line between, us and Europe. That's crazy to kind of consider. So again, and just like, I mean, I'd love to like have Lauren on this show too, be the maritime professor, Lauren Began, and like the alliances have already changed with carriers. Just like how would that change carrier alliances, and how would that shape just global pricing, and add the security level to it all too. It gets like super interesting.
Brokering success demands a battle-ready strategy. Tide TMS equips freight brokers with the ultimate battle station for conquering a tough market. With Tide, brokers gain access to a comprehensive platform where rate intelligence and quote history converge on a single screen. It's not just a page, it's a strategic command center designed to help brokers win. Tide equips your team with all of the data they need to negotiate with confidence and allows them to communicate directly with carriers and customers from a simple control base. Revolutionize the way your brokers perform by giving them a competitive advantage with Tide TMS. For more info, go to tai-software.com/battle stations, and we also have a link for you in the show notes to sign up for a demo.
If you're watching the video version of this, I just pulled up the graphic that shows what I was referring to as far as like map purposes wise, like how close all of these countries are for this one trade lane area. And you can see like it's gonna pull like a Sarah Palin, like, oh, I can see Russia in my backyard, which the United States is literally right there, right next to fucking Russia, or freaking Russia. I probably shouldn't cuss like that on the show. But
Hey,
yeah.
close. It's close.
But you can see on this map all of the different trade lanes that have been established, the trade routes, and then all of the yellow dots are ports that are currently already existing in this area. And so as this ice melts more and more, you're going to see more ports pop up, especially on the Russian side of things, because this was a major initiative, a major focus of the country, from what I understand, before the Ukraine invasion. And so since then, their supplies and their budgets and their focus have been on that, less on this. And so this will arguably, I guess, depending on which way the war goes in the future, this is going to be a focus again for Russia. Another graphic that I wanted to bring up too is the exclusive economic zone. And so this is an area of that same map I just showed you, of which the US has rights to from an economic perspective. And so that's more along the lines of just I guess they can drill for like natural resources, natural gas, oil, things like that. And so that is, that's another concern, I guess, is the economic zone and who controls these different areas and who doesn't. And it sort of brings up the earlier point of like Canada, like some of this shoreline or is starting to even emerge for them. And so that's a territory that they have to claim. And, very like, it's with Antarctica at the South Pole, all of the world's nations kind of have a pact, have an agreement. They have their own little sections of Antarctica. where the Arctic, it's still very much like up in it's up for debate, I guess, and so where those borders are and where it's being contested, and some countries recognize certain borders and then other countries don't recognize those borders, and so it's just, I think it's just a really fascinating topic that I'm glad we got to cover in this show. I do wonder though, is there any difference between some of these Arctic, I guess, icebreakers and I guess strategy versus the Great Lakes area? Like, is it largely the same? Is it maybe just the Great Lakes shippers kind of all stay within the Great Lakes, or what is, do you know any of, I guess, that routing that goes on up there? Like, are these Chinese companies coming in, or
Uh, it doesn't. I don't think so. I know most of them are ran by the U.S. Coast Guard.
Mm.
There's I want to see. I was just looking at the number of them here in the United States. Most of them are used though. Of all the ships, icebreakers that the United States own, most of them, which I had that number. Where did it
I
go?
thought we only had two. Maybe it's just two Arctic
We have two
icebreakers.
that was the point I was gonna make. We only have two that we have 12 total.
Mm.
Only two are functional for the Arctic, whereas Russia has 41 in particular. Finland looks like 11. Canada has 20. Again, not all of those are for the Arctic, though. It sounds like some of that's for, I think, the Hudson Bay up there.
Hmm.
And but they're building more out of Canada, and then China has just 5. But again, they're so close to Russia, to say that they would never work together on that is silly. So they're building. It sounds like 2 more here in the United States. They're building more. The number's not on here right now of how many they're looking to build. But yeah, the ones that are in the Great Lakes are just like nowhere near the type of icebreaker that you would need for that type of ice in particular.
Because
But
it does make me wonder with
they aren't like, they are, I will say they are Coast Guard run. So there's
Mm.
no like entity
like a
that's
commercial operation.
yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, they're
Technically Navy ran, I guess, if you looked at it that way.
because the reason I asked about that is because my brain goes to, well, China's kind of doing the same thing with Mexico right now, where they're just sending a lot of freight into Mexico and then just
Yeah.
trucking it in. Like, would they do the same
I
thing with
see.
Canada and then just truck it in on the other side? So I was just curious about that, which I'm sure they
True.
would, especially if they can establish rail lines.
I think the big problem there would be, yes, you have rail lines, but they're like, how covered in snow are they at certain times of the year? I think the
Good point.
infrastructure is nowhere near that of Mexico. So, but like, again, it depends on if you, I'm sure if you built a port somewhere between like Alaska and so like a Canadian port, right? Like that could be an option depending on the times of the year. But I know, again, ice road trucking, it's really dangerous up there. So I would, a lot of times those guys are just driving on ice, right? So again, I would just, if anything though, I don't think you're wrong. I think again goes back to my statement on like this lane, like think of the trickling effect of the economy it could do. I mean, there would need to be more truckers up there. There would need to be more towns and settlements, right, for those people that are helping move any of those goods. So again, I don't think out of the question, especially because if we're losing that much ice, I would assume at some point we're going to see less snow in some of those areas too. So a lot of what ifs, right, on that plan.
And there's, as I was watching a lot of these videos too, just breaking down like what icebreakers are, why this Northwest Passage is so important, and why it could change things from a geopolitical perspective. And a lot of the videos were showing like these, ships that are coming from China and leaving the East Coast, and they're going all the way up to the Northwest Passage, or they're going all the way through like the Panama Canal. I'm like, why don't they just go to LA? Like, why are you going all the way around? And apparently it's the from what I understand, the Malacca Strait is where a lot of the Chinese ports are located. And if the ships come out of those areas, that's where there's a lot of geopolitical tension because of Taiwan, because of Japan, like the Philippines. And that's a lot of contested waters there. And so that's why these other routes where China either goes north or they go through the Panama Canal, that's why it makes much more sense for them to avoid the drama in the Malacca Strait or the potential of drama in the Malacca Strait and take these routes to the US instead. So it also has some US implications too. Like, is the Port of LA, is Long Beach, are those going to, be impacted by the Northwest Passage as well? And so a lot of these questions we can't answer today, but fascinating discussion regardless.
I do want to throw out some numbers on here though, because it is like kind of crazy.
Let's do
What
it.
this would cost when we talk about like where is this money going to come from too. So it looks like the Coast Guard has what they call a PSC program right now, a polar security cutter program that would aims to acquire 4 or 5 new heavy polar icebreakers, and an acquisition of a new Arctic security cutter, so a medium polar icebreaker. They
Cutter? Is
estimated,
that what you're saying? A cutter? Like they cut
yes,
through the ice, I guess?
yep.
So
So
it's
like
another word for
basically,
icebreaker?
it's basically like a heavy duty one and a medium sized one,
Mm.
or a medium effort, I would assume they mean. And it looks like estimated cost for the big one is, I gotta move things over, $1.2 billion for the first ship, 921 million for the second ship, and $1.1 billion for the third ship. So again, it's just so crazy, right? Another thing we're gonna have to figure out taxpayer wise, right? But it's just the money behind it is crazy. There's like a whole report. I'm sure you probably have some of the data from that too on your
Well,
side. But
there's so many, like, just it's untouched land too. So it's the
yes,
minerals, the natural resources. I'm sure like lithium deposits and things like that, wars are being fought all over the world for. And so it's just an unfortunate reality that that's going to be something that they fight over next. And how are they going to pay for it? Well, probably through some of those natural resources, I
yeah,
would imagine, or securities budgets. I'm sure they can justify a lot of things for securing that
oil.
additional area.
There's oil somewhere,
Yeah.
oil will pay for it.